So let me immediately begin with you, Bret. You are recognized by many as one of the foremost defenders of Israel in the English language. Some consider you to be the best current defender of Israel in the English language, from a very important perch at the Wall Street Journal.
I'm better in Spanish.
Well, you were raised in Mexico City. But you recently wrote a column that upset a lot of people. You said that Ehud Olmert should really be the prime minister of Israel right now, not Benjamin Netanyahu, because Netanyahu, you said, was all hat and no cattle. He talks a big talk. You predicted that he would go to the UN and say yet again, I'm laying down a line, we're going to attack Iran, we may have to act alone. You said Olmert actually did it with Syria's nuclear facilities. The next morning, the prime minister of Israel saw you, kind of joked with you a little bit about it. But were you serious about the article? Do you really think that Benjamin Netanyahu is not ready to strike Iran amidst this existential threat that they pose to Israel's continuity?
Well, look, I hope for the best, which is to say that I hope that he means what he says and is prepared to act if he needs to. I fear that Israel has walked itself into a corner by spending too much time trying to placate the United States rather than look after its security interests. There are few speakers in Israel's history who are more convincing and compelling than Benjamin Netanyahu, but if you look at his record, he's a very cautious and often very tactical politician. And I fear that the record of his, I guess now he's in his third term, but really the last 4 years, is that a lot of energy has been spent trying to get right with the Obama administration on the theory that the Obama administration, or President Obama, meant what he said when he told Jeffrey Goldberg, the journalist last year, that I, as the President of the United States, do not bluff. I will not allow Iran to get nuclear weapons. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you've been following what's happening in Syria, or vis-a-vis Syria in the last 2 months, you know perfectly well that this president does bluff, and that the state of Israel should be thinking very carefully about how credible U.S. assurances are. Let me put it to you in another way. If you've been following the news, and if you looked at the front page of the Wall Street Journal, one of the most interesting stories is to see the despair that our dear friends the Saudis have when it comes to Obama's seriousness with arming the moderate opposition, hopefully semi-moderate opposition, comparatively moderate opposition, in fighting the Assad regime in Syria. In May or June, I was on a conference call with Deputy National Security Advisor Benjamin Rhodes when he talked about how the administration was now committed to moving materiel to these rebels. Well, months later, it turns out they haven't moved anything, or they've moved de minimis amounts of equipment. So the Saudis are despairing of the credibility of American security guarantees. The Poles and the Czechs despaired of the credibility of those guarantees when the Obama administration pulled the carpet out from under them in 2009 on ballistic missile defense. This is a regime, or this is an administration that was honestly, I don't mean to say a regime. I do not consider this a regime. This is an administration.
So that was not a Freudian slip.
It might have been Freudian, but I'm unaware of it. This is an administration that goes out of its way to appease its enemies and does not think carefully about the harm it's doing to traditional American friendships and alliances around the world. So to get back to your question, the government of Israel, whatever your appraisal is of Benjamin Netanyahu's character or his fortitude, the government of Israel has to be seized with the fact that no more important issue confronts it than the prospect and imminent prospect of a nuclear Iran. That the consequences of an Israeli military strike might be serious for Israel, and no military strike in history has taken place without some forms of unintended consequences. But the perfectly foreseeable consequences of an Iran with nuclear weapons is a catastrophe for the state of Israel, and by the way, a catastrophe for the United States as well. And that is what we need to think about. You know, more than once in history.
So were you prodding him?
One last point. More than once in the last 60 years, it has been Israel that has saved the United States from foreign policy disasters, and Americans ought to recognize that. In 1981, against the objections of the Reagan administration, Israel did what had to be done to stop Iraq from gaining a nuclear weapon. And it was only 10 years later that then Defense Secretary Dick Cheney recognized what a contribution that Israel made to Western security then. We're coming up on that moment now. Was I trying to goad Bibi Netanyahu? Yes, I was, and I succeeded.
Okay, so that's why you wrote the column. You wrote the column because you were trying to push the prime minister to strike?
I was trying to push the prime minister to understand that that the state of Israel does not exist to ask the government of the United States for permission to do what's in its core national security interest.
So again, Bret, to you, is President Rouhani, is he telling the truth that he's more of a moderate? Is he a liar, as the prime minister said he is at the UN, that he's a wolf in sheep's clothing? And is Iran, just straight out, is Iran intent on attacking Israel? Are they an absolute existential threat, and there's no way to negotiate away from it? That this regime is militant, it has jihad on its mind, and Israel is its foremost target.
Look, something that in most conversations about nuclear weapons isn't sufficiently understood is the following. With nuclear weapons, possession is use. People say, oh, the Iranians would never be so crazy as to try to attack Israel with nuclear weapons because they know that Israel has the capability for devastating reprisal. I'm not so sure about that calculation, and I could go into that later. But when you have a nuclear weapon, you can do things as a country that countries that don't have nuclear weapons cannot. Okay? North Korea is this impoverished, famished regime, but they have our attention because they have nuclear weapons. Pakistan is a country that has produced almost nothing in its entire history, except its most distinguished citizens always manage to leave the country, which is an interesting subject unto itself, but they have nuclear weapons, so they have our attention. They are important in the way that a Kyrgyzstan or Turkmenistan is simply not. If Turkmenistan got nuclear weapons, believe me, we'd all become Turkmenistan experts. So the idea that Iran gets a nuclear weapon means that it believes that it's invulnerable to attack, to regime change, that it can activate its allies in Hezbollah and Hamas against Israel in the way that it cannot now, that it can potentially strike Jewish targets around the world even more aggressively than it does now. Think about it. This is a country that was prepared to blow up a restaurant in Washington, D.C. without the benefit of a nuclear umbrella. What would it be prepared to do if it had a nuclear umbrella? Just how much more aggressive would it be? So this kind of idiot think that you hear among supposedly sophisticated people, oh, Israel has the means of reprisal, et cetera, is a foolish way of thinking. Now with Rouhani, here's the question. Bibi says he's a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? Maybe, or maybe he's a sheep among wolves. It doesn't really matter, because what matters in Iran is not President Rouhani. It is the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, and the extremist mullahs who are around them. They are the center of political gravity for the time being. Now, no one should for one second confuse them with the vast majority of Iranians who would be delighted to get rid of this obnoxious, awful, repressive regime. And those are the people that we should find ways to support, by the way. When people say, oh, all you want to do is, bomb Iran, et cetera, no, excuse me. I'm on the side of the people of Iran, and the people who want to appease the regime are on the side of the oppressors of the people of Iran. But in terms of the way we understand Iranian politics, we shouldn't be asking ourselves questions about Rouhani's psychology. We should be analyzing the actual political reality of a regime which has been under the sway of the supreme leader. They don't call you supreme leader if you're the semi-supreme leader. you know, if you're the supreme leader in name only, it's not like a university president where you really have no control. He is the dictator of this country, above all on the nuclear portfolio. So this
turn off his microphone, please?
This fascination with Rouhani is a sign of our own political and strategic short-sightedness. You know, when Rouhani is supreme leader, and that day will probably never happen, then we can have a conversation about whether he's a Gorbachev or not. Right now, he's a Kosygin, and there's a Brezhnev above him. If some of you get this analogy, and Brezhnev is the bad guy.
Bret.
Well, I was just going to say that the advice that...
First of all, do you agree with what Sheldon said?
98%.
Is this payback for what he said about your column?
I don't know, your interpretation. In 1986, Rouhani was caught on tape offering advice to a person he believed was a US administration official but turned out to be an Israeli agent on how to negotiate with Iran. And he said, you guys want your hostages freed? He was talking about the American hostages in Lebanon. You need to show strength. You need to show that you're prepared to take military action and you'll get your hostages free. The whole purpose of Rouhani's speech to this Israeli agent was to say, Khomeini only answers to demonstrations of strength. What do we know about the Iranian nuclear program? We know that there was 1 year in which they suspended their program. Miraculously, that year was 2003, when a large American army of 150,000 troops drove all the way to Baghdad and made it appeared that the United States was very serious about dealing with rogue regimes that it believed had weapons of mass destruction. That was the 1 year in which they suspended their nuclear program. I want to make just one ancillary point that, in a sense, touches on what you've just said, but it's important because I suspect there are people here who want to paint what's going on the stage as this demonstration of insane right-wing craziness. You know, you want to bomb Iran, you're warmongers, etc. Okay? I want these people, whoever you are in the audience, to think of this. A regime that is capable of taking a stone in one hand and stoning a woman to death. A regime that hangs gay people from cranes in the streets of Tehran should not, under any circumstances, get anywhere near a nuclear bomb so they can do likewise to other people. The people who keep saying we need to conciliate with Iran, we need to find a modus vivendi with them, we need to meet them halfway, okay, are objectively fellow traveling with one of the most repressive regimes in the world today. And by the way, when you ask about Rouhani, whatever he is now, he's a moderate, he's not such a moderate, he has been a fellow traveler, in fact, a senior member of a regime that has done more harm and caused more mayhem to its own with its own people and to other people, not the least of whom are Jews, for 34 years. So people who go out and say, oh, those crazy right-wingers are warmongers against Iran, okay, we need to find peace with Iran. You're finding peace with a regime that is the #1 repressor of women, of gay people, of religious minorities, of Jews, and so on. If you call yourself a liberal under those circumstances, you need to re-examine what your liberalism is all about.
I want to put something to you about what Sheldon just said about his new attempt for Hasbara to explain Israel. Bret, you write for the Wall Street Journal, you're a defender of Israel. How is it possible that a democracy in the Middle East, 7 million Jewish strong, 6 million Jewish strong, 1.5 million Arab citizens, full citizens, yes, there is Judea and Samaria, the West Bank dispute going on, but how is it possible that that democracy that treats women as absolute equals, that had a female prime minister, that has Arab MKs, that has an Arab on the Supreme Court, how has Israel's opponents successfully demonstrated to the world, I mean, fraudulently, but successfully in people's minds, that Israel's the aggressor, that Israel is persecuting people, that Israel's the bad guy. How did we lose that public relations battle? How could that have happened?
Well, the short answer is the combination of envy being the most powerful emotion in the world, and on the one side, and on the other side, a kind of mysterious and neurotic Jewish guilt that wants to in some ways placate that envy by acknowledging some kind of guilt. This is what explains this Jewish obsession with trying to, quote, atone for this or that Israeli action in its history. I mean, who are the most vociferous critics of Israel in the world today? And among the most articulate, I'm sorry to say, are many Jews who are seized with this neurosis. I think it's the only thing I can, the only way I can describe it. Look, I was reflecting on a few things Sheldon was saying about his new Hasbara effort, which is, I think, impressive and commendable. But you're never going to win over Israel's enemies by showing how excellent Israel is, or Israel's critics. You're going to enrage Israel's critics by showing them the excellence of the state of Israel. People foam at the mouth. I mean, if Israel were some nothing country in the middle of nowhere, no one would give a damn about Israel, okay? It's Israel's success which inspires this fanatical hatred that these people, the most despised people in the world, the most despised people in the shtetls of Europe, or throughout the Arab or Muslim Middle East, that they should have risen the way they have and succeeded the way they have. We are not going to win a Hasbara battle against our adversaries. This is where we're going to win a Hasbara battle, by winning over our potential friends. First within the Jewish community, but beyond the Jewish community. Just a brief story.
The enemies are lost.
Of course the enemies are lost. I mean, you know, what can you say? Oh, we win all these Nobel Prizes, we cure polio, we're really sorry about the West Bank situation, you know, this is, you know, Jews will not win with conspicuous displays of Woody Allen-esque existential anxiety. But this is what we can do. I'll tell a quick story. Some people have heard me tell the story before, but it made such an indelible impression on me. I went to go give a speech at some synagogue in Cleveland. And there's a typical synagogue crowd, middle-aged, older Jews. And then there's this one young Chinese woman. She comes up, introduces herself. She's from Shanghai. I said, well, you know, what do you do? She said she was an MBA student at Case Western, I think. And I said, oh, so what brings you here, other than shopping for Jewish husband? And she said, this was her answer. I'll never forget. She said, we Chinese people know Jews are the smartest people in the world. And I was like, oh, come on. I mean, you know, there are lots of smart people, lots of smart Chinese people, you know, smart people everywhere. And she looked at me and she said, no, Jews, smartest people in the world. And then I can swear, I mean, this might be an invention of memory, but I think she literally poked her finger in my chest and she said, Jewish people, Nobel Prize in Physics, 36%. Nobel Prize in Economics, 58%. It was some, I forgot the figures, but they're just sort of mind-boggling and astonishing. And she was saying something quite interesting. She was telling me that, and she said, by the way, this is something all Chinese people, she claimed, know. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, okay? This is just an anecdote, okay? But what she was saying is, this is a commonly held belief among, 1.3 billion people in this rising country. What are we doing to win over Chinese to think, hey, Israel, Jews, terrific people, be our friends? We are doing basically nothing, okay? Maybe there's a synagogue, Kaifeng Jews, Shanghai revival, basically zilch.
So what should we do?
Okay? We should be reaching out not to the campuses at Columbia and saying, oh, you know, we're not as obnoxious as you think. Not to our enemies. We should be going to places where we can find potential friends, whether it's in Beijing or New Delhi or flyover country America and Nebraska, where people aren't arriving on campus with these prejudices about how Israel is this apartheid colonial oppressor state, et cetera, et cetera. That's the strategy. Forget the enemies, win over the people who are inclined to be your friends. I would make one small point now on assimilation, which is related to the philanthropic issue, and it's this. Okay, is Judaism an open enrollment university? Because City College tried that in the 60s and 70s, and its reputation plummeted. No, we happen to be an elite university, so to some extent, this anxiety about declining numbers is misplaced. You asked about Jews and religion and identity. So long as there's Israel, okay, super secular Jews like me will have a locus of pride and affinity. And that's one of the reasons why Israel is so important to the rest of the Jewish assimilating world. But the point I want to make is this. Where we need to be sure we are doing our utmost is ensuring Jewish excellence, not Jewish numbers. Okay, numbers and excellence are very different things. And one of the most concerning pieces of news, you talked about the Pew Survey. I don't care about the Pew Survey. What I care about is that 2 Israelis won the Nobel Prize just a couple weeks ago, and where are they? They're at Stanford and at USC. How do you make sure that those Israelis and the brightest Jewish minds in chemistry, in physics, in medicine are finding Israel the best place to forge their careers and make their reputations and win their Nobel Prizes? I think that's really the challenge, making sure that whatever the numbers are, the Jewish people are always associated with the best in the world.
So to stem the Israeli brain drain. Okay. By the way, I want to applaud your column about Israel academics. He wrote a brilliant column in the Wall Street Journal lamenting the fact that Israel has a brain drain, losing all these Nobel Prize winners to other universities.
Well, and that's something that we should be thinking about how to reverse. That's an important consideration for Israel, that it remains a center and a net importer of human excellence, not a net exporter of human excellence. Look, more numbers would be great. Would I be happier with Israel with 50 million Jews as opposed to 6 million Jews? Sure. Is that likely to happen? No, it's not likely to happen. Is it something that should concern us? Yes. Should it be our primary concern? I'm not so sure. You talked a lot about the importance of Jewish values and Jewish observance. The important Jewish value that I observe as a person who is as minimally Jewish as you can be without actually tipping over into Unitarianism is a sense of loyalty. And I think the distinction here is between those Jews who assimilate but remain loyal and those Jews who assimilate but betray. And there are plenty of Jews in the second category whose names needn't be mentioned. When I was at the Jerusalem Post, the last speech I gave was at an Orthodox synagogue in Israel, and I said to a very Orthodox community, I said, to me, the Jewish world is like a solar system, and I'm like Pluto. I'm orbiting elliptically very far away.
Pluto is no longer a planet, by the way.
I know. I'm not even a person. I'm not a planet either.
What is it, a dog?
They call it something else now.
A planetoid. It's a planetoid. At any rate, but the point is, I'm in the orbit. And I'm held in that orbit by a sense that there are these Orthodox people who really do observe and do go more than the 9 yards, and they are a source of gravitational attraction for me, so that maybe my kids will be a tiny bit more observant than I am. And then there is Israel, which reminds me that there is a center of Jewish life and Jewish excellence and Jewish pride and sovereignty, and that is that gravitational pull for me. That is, I think, how we remain a vibrant Jewish community that understands that the satellites have to respect the sun and vice versa, to take this astronomical metaphor beyond its limits. That's, I think, what you need to do. But it's important.
Who's the sun in this model?
The sun is ultimately Israel. I mean, there are 2 suns. Okay, look. It's a different universe. There are 2 suns. There's Israel. There's the Jewish religion. Whatever. There's a center of gravity. Okay. to which the rest of the semi-assimilated or mostly secular Jewish world ought to maintain some kind of relationship, some kind of sense of loyalty. And by the way, it makes for a richer Jewish life. You know, when a Jew wins the Nobel Prize, we say, oh, a Jew won the Nobel Prize, right? We don't say, well, you know, he's not particularly observant, right? You know, gee, I mean, I haven't seen him in shul for 30 years, right? What we want is to create Jews who, at some level, say, wake up in the morning, and maybe in some stray thought as they're shaving or doing whatever, they say, you know, I'm a Jew, and that's fantastic. And that is fantastic.
You know, at Hillel, when we were trying to figure out what kind of possible outcome, what are the metrics and the measures? I mean, it's something of a business. What's success? So it's an inelegant term, but you just reminded me of it. For me, it was, if Jewish kids walk off of campus and say, this Jewish thing means something to me, then we won. As long as in the rest of the Jewish community, there are opportunities for them to connect with Jewishness. So I actually agree with you, I'm sorry to say.
Don't say actually. Don't
well, no, because I didn't know there were two sons. And I'm president of a university, and you don't want me to say that.
Oh, by the way, can I say one more thing?
Sheldon has a dispute with you about something.
Just one thing, okay? About you were talking about Harvard and the importance of being vibrant and present on so-called elite campuses. You know, my mother made a very wise remark after I won the Pulitzer. She said, "Oh, that's nice. This way stupid people will know you're smart." And essentially, going to school like Harvard is the way stupid people know you're smart, right? You can say, "Oh, I went to Harvard." I mean, you can be picking your nose, but oh, I went to Harvard, right? There are lots of elites, okay, or lots of people who will become the elite who are not currently enrolled in one of the top 10 universities, so-called top 10 universities in America.
I agree with
the
that.
elite is being created at some distant point in the future, and it's not being recognized by where U.S. News and World Report places your university, or even when a Pulitzer committee hands you a Tiffany crystal. Okay, that's not the signal of excellence.
I agree that Israel is probably going to face a lot of pressure to cede land for peace. And let me begin with you, Bret, and then go to Sheldon, and then go to Richard. You originally supported the Gaza withdrawal, but you later repudiated that support, which was a very brave thing for someone to do, to actually repudiate his own position. I've rarely seen that in print. Should Israel trade land for peace? Should Bibi succumb to undoubtedly a lot of pressure that's going to come his way?
Well, right. I mean, when you stake a position and it's demonstrated to be wrong, you should recant the position. Look, the most that I can say...
Why were you wrong on Gaza?
Well, the most that I can say is that if Gaza was supposed to be a test case for what a Palestinian state might look like, it was one hell of a test case. The first thing that happened, it was the destruction of the economic assets that Israel and Jim Wolfenson had labored to maintain in place, so that Gaza might have been a showcase of what a Palestinian state might be. People say, oh, it's so small, it's so crowded. A, it's not crowded. Anyone who's actually been to Gaza, as I have, knows it's not crowded. And B, what's wrong with small? Hong Kong is small, Singapore is small, Macau is small. These places thrive. So what you saw in Gaza was what a Palestinian state would look like. First a civil war, then Hamas takeover, an entrepot for global terror, a threat not just to Israel, but a threat also to its other forgotten neighbor, Egypt, to its south, a hotbed for fanaticism, a place where women are repressed, can't run in marathons because they might have to wear running shorts, and so on. So you have to sort of accept the evidence of experience. You know, I've often said I'm in favor of a two-state solution, provided the state on the other side of the border is Canada. Okay?
Is what?
Is Canada. Is Canada.
And I mean this very seriously to people who say, oh, you know, pro-Palestinian people, like, I say this and they say, oh, you know, that's ridiculous. And what they're saying is, it's ridiculous to expect that Palestinians should be expected to behave like Canadians. That is, peaceable, funny accents, odd sporting habits, but basically, you know, good people, right? And they say, oh, that's horrible. How can you say that? No, it's horrible of the so-called pro-Palestinians to just write off the Palestinians as a people who are totally incapable of liberal, democratic, peaceable, tolerant, pluralistic government. So by all means, I go back to the 1967 lines. If the 1967 lines are the 49th parallel, I have no objection to that. But if all we're doing is midwifing into existence another fanatical, failed, dysfunctional state committed not to building up its own institutions, but committed entirely to the destruction of its neighbors, plural, Jordan, Egypt, as well as Israel, then I think it's an insanity to support this kind of state. Let's do the Palestinians the honor of saying, we expect the international community knows that there are Kurds who wish they had a state, and there are Tamils who wish they had a state, and there are Tibetans who wish they had a state. There are many stateless people, okay? And the world being what it is, we expect you to demonstrate your worthiness and your readiness to have a state. Because you know what? When you look at all the post-colonial experiments from 1947 onwards, there's about one success story. One state that emerged as a little third world country with few natural resources and ended up being this wildly successful first world country. That's Israel. Let's say to the Palestinians, we look forward to where your faculty produces more than so-called engineers who are experts in explosives. Show us what you can produce in terms of agriculture, in terms of genuine human rights, in terms of theater, the arts, respect for culture, respect for antiquities. And by the way, am I saying anything outrageous? I'm not. But there are a few people in this audience who are going, oh my God, you know, it's outrageous. You know, no, people are not born with a natural, immediate right to self-determination. They have to demonstrate that right. That is the reality of politics and history. So let us say to the Palestinians, by all means, prove to us you want to earn the right to have a state that will make you, as Palestinians and the rest of the world, proud.
Okay. So let me immediately begin with you, Bret. You are recognized by many as one of the foremost defenders of Israel in the English language. Some consider you to be the best current defender of Israel in the English language, from a very important perch at the Wall Street Journal.
I'm better in Spanish.
Well, you were raised in Mexico City. But you recently wrote a column that upset a lot of people. You said that Ehud Olmert should really be the prime minister of Israel right now, not Benjamin Netanyahu, because Netanyahu, you said, was all hat and no cattle. He talks a big talk. You predicted that he would go to the UN and say yet again, I'm laying down a line, we're going to attack Iran, we may have to act alone. You said Olmert actually did it with Syria's nuclear facilities. The next morning, the prime minister of Israel saw you, kind of joked with you a little bit about it. But were you serious about the article? Do you really think that Benjamin Netanyahu is not ready to strike Iran amidst this existential threat that they pose to Israel's continuity?
Well, look, then the prospect, an imminent prospect of a nuclear Iran, that the consequences of an Israeli military strike might be serious for Israel, and no military strike in history has taken place without some forms of unintended consequences. But the perfectly foreseeable consequences of an Iran with nuclear weapons is a catastrophe for the state of Israel, and by the way, a catastrophe for the United States as well. And that is what we need to think about. You know, more than once in history.
So were you prodding him?
One last point. More than once in the last 60 years, it has been Israel that has saved the United States from foreign policy disasters, and Americans ought to recognize that. In 1981, against the objections of the Reagan administration, Israel did what had to be done to stop Iraq from gaining a nuclear weapon. And it was only 10 years later that then Defense Secretary Dick Cheney recognized what a contribution that Israel made to Western. Turns out they haven't moved anything, or they've moved de minimis amounts of equipment. So the Saudis are despairing of the credibility of American security guarantees. The Poles and the Czechs despaired of the credibility of those guarantees when the Obama administration pulled the carpet out from under them in 2009 on ballistic missile defense. This is a regime, or this is an administration that was honestly, I don't mean to say a regime. I do not consider this a regime. This is an administration.
So that was not a Freudian slip.
It might have been Freudian, but I'm unaware of it. This is an administration that goes out of its way to appease its enemies and does not think carefully about the harm it's doing to traditional American friendships and alliances around the world. So to get back to your question, the government of Israel, whatever your appraisal is of Benjamin Netanyahu's character or his fortitude, the government of Israel has to be seized with the fact that no more important issue confronts. I've been following what's happening in Syria, or vis-a-vis Syria, in the last 2 months. You know perfectly well that this president does bluff, and that the state of Israel should be thinking very carefully about how credible U.S. assurances are. Let me put it to you in another way. If you've been following the news, and if you looked at the front page of the Wall Street Journal, one of the most interesting stories is to see the despair that our dear friends the Saudis have when it comes to Obama's seriousness with arming the moderate opposition, hopefully semi-moderate opposition, comparatively moderate opposition, in fighting the Assad regime in Syria. In May or June, I was on a conference call with Deputy National Security Advisor Benjamin Rhodes when he talked about how the administration was now committed to moving materiel to these rebels. Well, months later, I hope for the best, which is to say that I hope that he means what he says and is prepared to act if he needs to. I fear that Israel has walked itself into a corner by spending too much time trying to placate the United States rather than look after its security interests. There are few speakers in Israel's history who are more convincing and compelling than Benjamin Netanyahu, but if you look at his record, he's a very cautious and often very tactical politician. And I fear that the record of his, I guess now he's in his third term, but really the last 4 years, is that a lot of energy has been spent trying to get right with the Obama administration on the theory that the Obama administration, or President Obama, meant what he said when he told Jeffrey Goldberg, the journalist last year, that I, as the President of the United States, do not bluff. I will not allow Iran to get nuclear weapons. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you